It's a calm, pleasant Sunday morning in Boston, 1944. The streets are quiet, the air is filled with the sound of distant church bells, and the community is alive with optimism. Among the crowd are a group of Italian men, once enemy soldiers, now dressed in American uniforms. They tend to a victory garden, share laughter with the locals, and sit side by side at community meals. Just a few years ago, these same men were behind barbed wire in Texas, captured after Mussolini's disastrous desert campaign. But then, with a single signature on an armistice document, their entire fate shifted. Across the ocean, in the bitter cold of Europe, other Italian soldiers face a far different destiny. They shiver in the icy wind, forced into back-breaking labor with little food and almost no rest. Despised by their captors, distrusted by other prisoners, they bear the full wrath of the German Reich. Just a few years earlier, they too had served under the Mediterranean sun, stationed on the bright shores of Greece. But again, a single stroke of the pen had changed everything. Few soldiers in history saw their fates diverge as dramatically as the Italians did after 1943. In the early years of the Second World War, Italy fought as a loyal member of the Axis. But when Mussolini's government collapsed, and the new Italian administration signed an armistice with the Allies, everything changed overnight. The decision tore apart armies, families, and loyalties. For thousands of Italian soldiers scattered across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, the question of friend or foe became painfully unclear. And for those who had already fallen into enemy hands, their lives would now take very different paths depending on who held their chains. The British Empire became one of the main keepers of Italian prisoners of war. Between late 1940 and early 1941, nearly 200,000 Italians had been captured. Britain, already strained by war, needed to decide what to do with this massive influx of captives. Concerned about security, but also desperate for labor, the British government sent many prisoners far from the British Isles to remote regions of Australia and South Africa. Yet by mid-1941, the first Italian prisoners began arriving in Britain itself. These men soon became an unexpected resource. Britain faced a severe labor shortage, especially in agriculture and infrastructure. Instead of locking the Italians away behind high fences, the authorities found a more practical use for them. Many were assigned to individual farms where they worked alongside British civilians. Security checks were made to filter out fascist sympathizers, but overall, guards were few, and the supervision was light. The British saw them not as dangerous enemies, but as a valuable workforce keeping the home front alive. According to the Geneva Conventions, prisoners could perform non-military labor. So, Italians were soon busy in farms, forestry, and civil engineering projects. In British colonies like Kenya, they helped construct large public works, including roads such as the Great North Road. Conditions, while varying from place to place, were generally humane compared to other prison systems. In one camp, Working Camp 37 in Wincham, England, Italian prisoners lived in huts they built themselves. The shelters were insulated and heated to survive the cold English winters. The camp had clean water, lighting, ventilation, and 3 daily meals. Prisoners received pay for their labor and were only required to work 8 hours a day. They were allowed to read books, put on plays, and play music. Sports were common, and Sundays often brought friendly football matches between the Italians, their guards, and local village teams. Many even attended local events, sharing moments of humanity in the middle of a brutal global war. Mail from home arrived regularly, and each prisoner was permitted to send 1 letter and 1 postcard a week. These small connections to home reminded them that life still existed beyond the wire fences. For many, captivity in Britain was not a nightmare. It was survival with dignity. When the war finally ended, Axis soldiers across the world faced a grim return to countries scarred by years of destruction. Most had lost everything: their homes, their families, and their livelihoods. Many were forced to learn new trades just to rebuild their lives. For Italian prisoners, however, the path back was complicated. Following the 1943 armistice, the lives of Italian prisoners in Britain changed drastically. Italy's new leader, Marshal Pietro Badoglio, aligned his government with the Allies. Suddenly, Italian captives in Allied hands were no longer considered enemies but co-belligerents. In practice, that meant they were still prisoners, but of a nation that was now technically an ally. Those who chose to cooperate with the Allies enjoyed better treatment and more freedom of movement. They could work with civilians, travel short distances, and live in less restrictive camps. Those who refused cooperation were sent to stricter, more guarded facilities. The Allies had no desire to repatriate them quickly. Italian labor was far too valuable, and reconstruction efforts required manpower. So began a strange legal and moral situation. Thousands of Italians remained prisoners of war, yet their country was officially fighting on the same side as their captors. British officials made good use of this gray zone. Italians worked in farms, factories, and even helped in logistics connected to the Allied war effort. Around 63% of all Italian prisoners in Britain chose to cooperate. By the time peace came in 1945, most of these men had lived for years among the British. Many formed close ties with local families. Some even married British women. Repatriation was slow. Many prisoners weren't sent home until 1947. But even after returning to Italy, quite a few came back to Britain to start new lives. Across the Atlantic, in the United States, the story was remarkably similar. When Italian troops began surrendering in North Africa in 1943, American officials initially resisted bringing them to the U.S. mainland. But once again, the need for labor overcame security fears. Italian prisoners were soon working on American farms, replacing the labor shortage left by soldiers who had gone to war. They picked cotton in the South, harvested corn in the Midwest, and dug potatoes in the North. The treatment they received was surprisingly good. One Italian prisoner recalled with amazement, "At 6 p.m., American soldiers brought us dinner, cheese, an egg, prosciutto, salad, iced tea, and grapefruit. We thought we were in heaven." Prisoner chefs, often experienced Italian cooks, were allowed to prepare their own meals using camp supplies. American soldiers sometimes lined up outside the Italian kitchens just to taste their food. Camps were equipped with recreational spaces, libraries, and even small theaters. Prisoners could play music, perform plays, and take part in sports. Education became another unexpected opportunity. Many camps hosted classes where Italian prisoners learned English, engineering, mathematics, and literature. Educated men among them served as teachers. For some, this period of captivity became a turning point, a time of personal growth and learning, rather than only suffering. The U.S. government also established Italian service units, or ISUs. About 3/4 of Italian prisoners volunteered to join these groups. Their work ranged from building roads and cleaning parks to assisting in military logistics. Some used their knowledge of the Italian language and terrain to help Allied forces in Italy, guiding partisans fighting against the fascist regime in the north. While they were still officially prisoners, ISU members were paid like American privates and could sometimes leave camp on weekends. Yet joining these units was not an easy decision. Many Italians felt deep moral conflict. Helping the Allies meant opposing fellow Italians who still fought for Mussolini. But in the end, most saw it as a path to survival and redemption. Despite the relatively kind treatment, tensions existed. Some American civilians complained that the prisoners were treated too well, given their status as former enemies. Within the military, resentment lingered. American troops fighting and dying in Italy found it hard to accept that captured Italians were now being called co-belligerents. This sometimes led to harassment or friction between U.S. soldiers and Italian servicemen. Yet most Italian prisoners in America described their treatment as humane and respectful. One even said, "The Americans treated us too well, too well." Many who had fallen in love with American women or found peace in this new land decided to stay after the war. For them, America became not a place of captivity, but of new beginnings. However, not all Italian prisoners around the world were so fortunate. The fate of those who fell into German hands was far darker. After Italy's surrender, the German military launched Operation Axis, quickly moving to occupy the Italian peninsula and seize control of former Italian territories. The Italian army was thrown into chaos. Units were scattered, leadership crumbled, and communication collapsed. Some soldiers fled to join local resistance movements. Others were rounded up by their former allies, the Germans. These captured Italians faced a brutal choice: rejoin the Axis and fight for Mussolini's puppet state in northern Italy, or face the consequences. Most refused to return to battle. The Germans saw this as betrayal. To them, the Italians had turned their backs not once but twice, first in 1915, when Italy joined the Allies in World War I, and now again in 1943. In German custody, the Italians were stripped of their rights as prisoners of war. They were renamed Italian military internees to avoid the legal protections of the Geneva Convention. Later, many were reclassified again as civilian workers, further removing any international oversight. Life in German captivity was harsh and degrading. Prisoners endured long hours of forced labor in mines, factories, and farms. Food was scarce, shelters were poorly built, and the sick were left untreated. Tuberculosis, exhaustion, and malnutrition killed thousands. Those who worked too slowly or resisted orders were sometimes executed on the spot. The death rate among Italian captives in Germany was 4 times higher than that of Western European prisoners. Even after Germany's surrender, their suffering didn't end. Many Italian prisoners were not immediately released. Instead, they were transferred to camps run by other nations, France, Yugoslavia, and the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, the fate of Italian soldiers was especially grim. Some were captured during the Eastern Front campaigns. Others were taken by Soviet forces as they liberated German camps in 1945. Many were sent to remote prison camps deep inside Soviet territory. Out of about 65,000 Italians captured by the Soviets, only around 20,000 ever made it home. The reasons were many: hunger, disease, freezing cold, and exhaustion. The mortality rate among Italians in Soviet captivity reached nearly 60%, far higher than that of Germans or Romanians. Many of these men had already survived the brutal retreat from Stalingrad, where they marched hundreds of kilometers in temperatures as low as -30 degrees Celsius. Weak, frostbitten, and starving, thousands collapsed along the way and never rose again. Those who reached the camps found little comfort. Overcrowded barracks, thin clothing, and watery soup were the norm. Some prisoners volunteered for re-education programs run by the Soviets, hoping for slightly better conditions. A few Soviet civilians and soldiers showed kindness, sharing food or helping the sick, but such moments were rare. Repatriation began slowly after the war. The Soviet government started sending prisoners home as early as August 1945, but the process dragged on for over a year. Many families in Italy never learned the fate of their loved ones. For decades, the story of those who vanished in the East remained a painful mystery. Back in Italy, the armistice had created a civil war. The country was split in two, the north under Mussolini's last regime, and the south under Allied control. Former fascists were now prisoners themselves, held by Italian forces loyal to the new government. The chaos that followed the fall of fascism was marked by revenge, confusion, and political struggle. Some fascist officers and officials escaped punishment altogether. The new government was weak and eager to stabilize the country, so it avoided harsh purges. Figures responsible for war crimes in places like Slovenia kept their ranks and even returned to power. Others, however, faced violent retribution from partisan groups. By the end of the war, mob justice had become common in northern Italy. With Mussolini's death, emotions boiled over. Partisan fighters hunted down fascist officials and collaborators. In some cities, makeshift people's courts sentenced them to death without formal trials. In Rome, Milan, and other major cities, prison riots and lynchings took place. Conditions in Italy's post-war prisons were dreadful. Overcrowded cells, scarce food, and filth defined daily life. Corruption was rampant, and many high-ranking fascists managed to bribe their way to freedom or escape abroad. Meanwhile, thousands of lower-ranking prisoners languished in mud-filled yards and decaying buildings. By 1946, the violence began to subside. The Italian monarchy, seen by many as a relic of fascism, was abolished by popular vote. The new republic sought to heal and move on. A general amnesty was declared in June 1946, forgiving most former fascists and collaborators. The decision was meant to unify the nation, though it also allowed many guilty men to walk free. In the years that followed, the fate of Italy's captured soldiers became a symbol in political debates. The suffering of those held by the Nazis was used to show Italy as a victim of German aggression. Those captured by the Soviets became symbols in the anti-communist struggle of the Cold War. But those who had been treated well in the West were often ignored. They didn't fit the new national story Italy wanted to tell. Even decades later, many survivors spoke of the haunting memories that never left them. Men who had lived through the frozen marches in Russia or the camps in Germany carried their scars for life. Families were divided. Some members had fought for the Allies, others for the Axis. Returning home, many veterans found no jobs, little recognition, and fading health. Some emigrated. Others stayed in the countries where they had been imprisoned, marrying and starting new families. Meanwhile, far from Europe, a German prisoner stands in the hot sun of a southern U.S. farm. His hands grip a shovel as he digs into soft, warm soil. For the past year, he has worked the fields, watched American films at night, and dreamed about returning home. The Americans make him work hard, but they feed him well and treat him better than many of the local sharecroppers. Perhaps, he thinks, when the war is over, he'll become a farmer himself. In another part of the world, another German prisoner digs into the frozen ground of the Soviet Union. The air bites his skin. His breath clouds in the cold. Around him lie the bodies of men who didn't make it. The Soviets work their captives to exhaustion, struggling themselves to survive the shortages of war. The German soldier pushes his shovel into the icy soil, wondering if this hole he's digging might soon become his own grave. When Victory in Europe Day was declared in May 1945, the guns finally fell silent, but for millions of German soldiers the war was far from over. Across the continent, the Allied powers now held nearly 11 million German prisoners of war. Around 8 million had surrendered to the Western Allies, the United States, Britain, and France, while roughly 3 million found themselves under Soviet control. Europe had been freed from Nazi tyranny, but this victory came with a grim dilemma. What would happen to those 11 million Axis soldiers after World War II? The question split the Allies. The Western nations were signatories to the Geneva Convention, which clearly stated that prisoners of war must be released once hostilities ended. The Soviet Union, however, had never signed that agreement. That single fact meant a German soldier's fate could depend entirely on which side captured him. And in the chaotic aftermath of total war, international law often mattered far less than vengeance and survival. In this chapter, we'll explore the very different paths these German soldiers faced after 1945, from labor camps and starvation to eventual repatriation, as well as the fate of Nazi war criminals who stood before the judgment of history. In February 1945, as the war was drawing to a close, the leaders of the Allied powers, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, met at the Yalta Conference in Crimea. Their purpose was to decide the final fate of a defeated Germany. The three agreed on one central principle. Germany must never again be allowed to threaten the peace of the world. To that end, they divided Germany into occupation zones, planned for reparations, and discussed the concept that the German people themselves would help rebuild what their nation had destroyed. This meant, in practice, using German prisoners as forced labor. Stalin demanded it outright, and while Roosevelt and Churchill were hesitant, they ultimately accepted it as a practical, if grim, necessity. During the war, German soldiers had been captured and held in more than 20 countries, even as far away as the United States. In America, many of these POWs were sent to rural areas, where they worked on farms or in factories, replacing the laborers who had gone off to fight. Across the southern U.S., German prisoners became a common sight. Some built genuine friendships with local Americans, even watching Hollywood films during their off hours. Overall, German POWs in U.S. custody were treated comparatively well. Official records list just under 500 deaths among the hundreds of thousands held there, a remarkably low number for wartime imprisonment. In Europe, however, conditions varied dramatically. American-run camps on the continent recorded death tolls in the low thousands, though some German sources claim as many as 40,000 may have died in American custody. The truth likely lies somewhere between, clouded by early prisoner releases and inconsistent records. The British Empire, meanwhile, managed about 2.5 million German prisoners by the end of the war. Conditions in Britain ranged widely, from simple tent camps in open fields to luxurious old estates converted into prison compounds. Many Germans in Britain developed cordial relationships with civilians, who sometimes gave them food or cigarettes not provided by the authorities. Prisoners who worked on British labor details earned about 2 shillings per day, modest, but fair compared to the times. British records indicate that 1,254 German POWs died in British custody. However, even in the West, things were not always humane. Interrogations of captured officers or suspected war criminals sometimes involved harsh treatment, even torture, to extract confessions. Still, those cases pale in comparison to what awaited German soldiers in French custody. When France was liberated, vengeance ran deep. German soldiers captured by the French or transferred there from American control faced some of the worst conditions in Western Europe. Civilians, still furious over years of occupation, often attacked prisoners with stones or sticks, sometimes killing them outright. Reports describe entire camps where conditions seemed designed not for detention, but extermination. One infamous camp near Sète gave its inmates rations worth only 900 calories a day, less than what the Nazis had. Officially allotted to Jews in the early Warsaw Ghetto, on average, 12 prisoners died there every single day. By the summer of 1945, the Red Cross warned that nearly 200,000 German POWs in French custody were facing starvation. The United States eventually halted further prisoner transfers to France and demanded that the French adhere to the Geneva Convention, though in practice, those protests were largely symbolic. Legally, the war's end should have meant repatriation, but in the devastated landscape of post-war Europe, it instead meant reparation. The US and Britain leased roughly 1 million German prisoners to France to help rebuild its shattered infrastructure. Thousands more were sent to Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. These men were set to work rebuilding roads, mining stone, and clearing fields of unexploded ordnance. In France and the Netherlands, many were forced to clear minefields, an unimaginably dangerous task that killed or maimed about 2,000 prisoners each month. It was an open violation of the Geneva Convention, but the Allies claimed a loophole. Since the German government no longer officially existed, these captives were no longer prisoners of war, and thus not legally protected. Meanwhile, in the East, the Soviet Union had its own plans, and they were far more severe. The Red Army had endured unspeakable losses during the German invasion, and the Soviet leadership fully intended to make the defeated Germans pay for it. As early as 1944, Soviet officials were drafting mass labor programs using German POWs. The Soviet ambassador to Britain, Ivan Maisky, proposed that Germany's captured soldiers should be given to the USSR as reparations for 10 years of forced labor. Stalin eagerly approved. By the time Germany surrendered, the plan was already in motion. German POWs, along with ethnic Germans living in Soviet-controlled territories, were rounded up and sent to work camps. Many were organized into labor battalions of 3,000 to 5,000 men, each divided into smaller companies. They toiled in mines, quarries, and factories, rebuilding the Soviet Union's bombed-out infrastructure. Roughly 3 million Germans became forced laborers in the USSR. Around one-third of them never came home. It's important to understand, however, that many of these deaths were not deliberate executions. The Eastern Front had been a war of total annihilation. No mercy given, none expected. Most prisoners arrived in Soviet camps already half-starved, sick, or injured. The Soviets, devastated by war and famine themselves, often lacked the resources to sustain them. Those too ill to work were sometimes simply released, left to survive as best they could. But the first 2 years after the war, conditions remained brutal, worsened by poor harvests and corruption. But as time passed, Soviet officials began to realize that the German labor force was costly to maintain and produced only limited economic benefit. German labor contributed barely 5% to the Soviet national output, far below the grand reparations Stalin had envisioned. By 1947, Moscow began to reconsider. The foreign ministers of the Allied powers agreed to begin repatriating all German POWs by 1948. In reality, the process dragged on for years, with the last large-scale returns taking place in 1950, and some convicted war criminals not released until 1956. In the end, the vast majority of German soldiers in Soviet hands endured years of grueling labor, but most were eventually allowed to go home, long before Maisky's proposed 10-year sentence expired. But not every German soldier had been captured. Some had deserted, others had been discharged, and many were simply too far from the front when the war ended. For these men, a new challenge awaited in a defeated and divided Germany. The Allied occupiers were determined to eradicate militarism in all forms. Veterans organizations, paramilitary groups, and military clubs were banned outright. Returning. Soldiers, stripped of uniforms and identity, came home to a nation in ruins, where even their past service was now viewed with suspicion. As part of the Allied denazification program, former soldiers were ordered to appear before tribunals that would assess their conduct during the war. Initially run by the occupying powers, these courts were later transferred to German control in 1946. Each defendant was classified into one of 5 categories: major offender, lesser offender, follower, or exonerated. Most ordinary Wehrmacht soldiers were deemed lesser offenders and placed on 3 years probation, barred from holding public office or running businesses. However, as caseloads grew into the millions, the system began to collapse under its own weight. Exceptions were made. Disabled veterans, impoverished men, and those born after 1919 were often excused entirely. While these leniencies sped up the process, they also allowed true Nazi sympathizers to slip through unnoticed. By the early 1950s, denazification was quietly abandoned, seen as inefficient and politically divisive. For many Germans, it became easier to shift all blame onto Hitler and a handful of his henchmen rather than confront personal responsibility. Ironically, within just a few years, many former Wehrmacht soldiers were back in uniform. With tensions rising between East and West, the newly formed Bundeswehr, established in 1955, recruited veterans to rebuild Germany's military under NATO. Some even served with the same weapons they had once turned against Allied soldiers. The Nuremberg trials became the world's attempt to bring the worst Nazi perpetrators to justice. Military officers, government ministers, and concentration camp guards stood accused of crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. Diaries, documents, photographs, and witness testimony, all revealing how deeply the German military was complicit in the atrocities of the regime. High-ranking figures like Joachim von Ribbentrop and Wilhelm Keitel were executed. Others received long prison sentences, while Hermann Göring famously took his own life, rather than face the gallows. Even a few women, such as Irma Grace, the notorious hyena of Auschwitz, were tried and executed for their brutality. A rare act at a time when executing women was almost unheard of. The common defense among these war criminals was chillingly uniform. We were just following orders. Many falsified documents to prove they had no choice, creating paper trails that obscured their guilt. Their families, desperate to move on, often defended them, helping spread a narrative of denial that seeped deep into post-war German society. By 1949, when the Federal Republic of Germany was established, the nation's first chancellor, Konrad Adenauer, sought to rebuild both the country and its pride. In 1950, he introduced a general amnesty for convicted war criminals, arguing that Germany's new role as a Western ally was more important than continuing to punish the past. An advisory board reviewed 105 cases of imprisoned war criminals. Of those, 84 had their sentences reduced or overturned entirely. This leniency helped fuel a powerful myth, the so-called clean Wehrmacht, the idea that the regular German army had fought honorably and had nothing to do with Nazi crimes. For decades, this myth persisted, allowing generations of Germans to separate their fathers and grandfathers from the horrors of the regime. Only later would historians begin to dismantle that illusion. War, like history itself, is never clean or simple. The captured soldiers of Germany expected to be treated according to the Geneva Convention, and often they were. But the brutal realities of post-war Europe blurred the lines between justice, revenge, and survival. The Allied use of forced German labor does not erase the atrocities committed by Nazi Germany. Yet the crimes of the Nazis cannot justify the violations committed in the name of peace. The story of what happened to Axis soldiers after World War II is not a tale of black and white, but of endless gray, where humanity and morality are tested in the aftermath of destruction. It is in these shadows, in these uncomfortable truths, that history's most important lessons lie. When the Second World War ended, the Western Allies had little desire to keep Japanese prisoners of war for long. Unlike the defeated German soldiers in Europe, The Japanese were not used as laborers to rebuild destroyed cities or sent to clear minefields. Instead, both the remnants of Japan's own government and the American occupation authorities wanted these men home as quickly as possible. Repatriation began in December 1945. The first to return were the sick and wounded, followed by ethnic Koreans and Taiwanese who had served under the Japanese flag, and then the Japanese soldiers stationed in China. The process was slow and chaotic. Those returning home were required to exchange any foreign money they carried for Japanese yen, a currency that had collapsed in value. Still, most didn't care about money. They were simply desperate to shed their prison clothes and feel like soldiers again, even if only for the final leg of their journey. While waiting to board ships home, thousands of repatriated soldiers were held in makeshift barracks and warehouses near the ports. These buildings were cold, bare, and overcrowded. The men slept on rough wooden floors with little protection against the freezing winter winds that swept across the Japanese coastline. Food was scarce and basic. Some veterans later wrote that the conditions were so miserable they wished they had remained in the prisoner camps in the Philippines. When their turn finally came, each man was given a small amount of money for train fare and just enough rations to last until he reached his hometown. But homecoming was rarely joyful. Many families had received official notices claiming that their sons or husbands were dead. In some cases, the Japanese authorities had deliberately issued false reports to avoid revealing the full number of prisoners still alive in foreign hands. For those families, seeing a man they believed dead walk through the door was both miraculous and deeply confusing. Some fainted in disbelief, others wept with relief and guilt. The returning soldiers, thin, exhausted, and often ill, shuffled through the streets of their towns still wearing surplus uniforms issued by their former captors. Some carried old military caps, others begged American troops for food or cigarettes. Their once proud empire had vanished, replaced by bombed ruins and foreign occupation. A few civilians tried to welcome them quietly, offering rice or small gifts. But for many Japanese citizens, the war's end was still an open wound. Their cities had been destroyed, their families lost, and the men who had once been hailed as national heroes now symbolized defeat. As one young student, Toru Takaya, remembered, when the soldiers left, everyone cheered. When they came home, no one said a word. People looked at them coldly. That coldness broke many of the soldiers. After years of indoctrination and brutal combat, they returned to a society that no longer knew what to do with them. Depression and shame were common. Some men quietly locked themselves inside their homes and never came out again. Others took their own lives. The collapse of the Japanese spirit after surrender was just as devastating as the collapse of its cities. The Soviet Union had not fought Japan directly for most of the war. A neutrality pact had kept the two empires from open conflict while both focused on their respective enemies, Nazi Germany and the United States. But in August 1945, as Japan was already on the brink of defeat, the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria, crushing the once feared Kwantung Army in a matter of days. Just 3 days after Japan's surrender, Stalin ordered that all captured Japanese soldiers in Manchuria be sent to the Soviet Union. The journey that followed was one of suffering and confusion. The prisoners were stripped of everything they owned: watches, rings, even boots, before being forced to march through shattered towns and railway lines. Along the way, they witnessed horrors: Japanese women assaulted by Red Army soldiers, civilians jeering at them, and soldiers dying from exhaustion. Many still believed they were being sent home. Instead, they were packed into cargo trains bound for Siberia. As the trains rumbled north, winter descended. Temperatures plummeted far below freezing. The Soviets provided no heating for the Japanese prisoners, and the metal walls of the train cars froze solid. Those who accidentally touched the iron surfaces lost the skin from their hands. When the transports finally stopped, the men were not home. They were deep in Siberia, standing in a frozen wasteland that had long served as the prison of the Soviet Union. Inside the camps, survival was a daily battle. The freezing cold drove the body into overdrive as it tried to stay warm, leaving the men unable to sleep for more than an hour or two at a time. They slept huddled together in piles to share body heat, in overcrowded wooden barracks with leaking roofs. To reach the outdoor latrines at night, meant losing your sleeping spot to another man. Illness spread quickly. The Soviets had lost hundreds of thousands of doctors and medics during the war, so most of the camp infirmaries were staffed by female doctors and nurses. To many Japanese soldiers, this was a deep humiliation, being stripped and examined monthly by women who shaved their bodies to prevent lice infestations. Yet these measures were not meant to shame them, they were a matter of necessity. Without them, disease would have wiped out entire camps. It's important to remember a painful truth here. During the war, the Japanese Empire committed enormous atrocities against prisoners, civilians, and entire nations. Forced labor, human experiments, mass killings, all were part of Japan's brutal campaign for dominance. Recognizing this does not justify what happened next, but it helps us understand the cycle of vengeance that followed. Just as Japan had abused Chinese, Filipino, and Allied prisoners, now the Soviets inflicted similar suffering on the Japanese. The victims had become the punished. The Siberian camps were not the only places of internment. Across the Soviet Union, camps appeared in Central Asia, the Urals, and even underground mines. Some were blistering hot in summer, others buried under meters of snow. Wherever they were sent, the Japanese prisoners were forced to work, building roads, bridges, railways, and factories. Stalin's orders were simple: make them help rebuild what they had helped destroy. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, divided prisoners into battalions of about 1,000 men each. Some worked as lumberjacks or miners, others laid rail tracks or repaired bombed infrastructure. A few camps were relatively tolerable, with light workloads and decent food. Others were death traps, where malnutrition and exhaustion killed hundreds. It was largely a matter of chance. A man's fate depended on which camp he was assigned to, how harsh the local climate was, and what the Soviets needed most in that area. Even in the best conditions, the work was relentless. Men labored from dawn to dusk, often in freezing temperatures or choking dust. They built railways with bare hands and primitive tools, hauling timbers and stone across frozen rivers. At night, they collapsed in silence, their bodies too broken for words. Back in Japan, the government, under American supervision, tried to bring order to the chaos of demobilization. Soldiers who had not been captured were processed quickly and assessed for useful civilian skills. Those with technical experience were prioritized for release and employment. The rest were sent home in waves, each given ration cards and basic supplies to start over. The new authorities encouraged returning veterans to join the rebuilding effort. Factories and farms needed hands, and Japan's cities lay in ruins. Many ex-soldiers took jobs in construction or transportation, helping restore the roads, bridges, and train lines destroyed during the bombing campaigns. Others worked for the American occupation forces, cooking, cleaning, or maintaining vehicles. The very headquarters of the American occupation in Tokyo was built and operated in part by these demobilized Japanese workers. But not all soldiers made it back, at least not right away. The Japanese Empire had once stretched across more than 20 million square miles, spanning Southeast Asia and the Pacific. News of the surrender did not reach every outpost. In the dense jungles and faraway islands, isolated garrisons continued to fight long after the war was over. Some soldiers simply refused to believe that Japan had surrendered. They thought the radio messages were Allied propaganda or that their emperor's voice had been faked. So they carried on, surviving on wild fruit and captured animals, waiting for reinforcements that would never come. One of the most remarkable cases was Corporal Shoichi Yokoi, who hid in the jungles of Guam for 28 years. When the United States recaptured the island in 1944, Yokoi's entire regiment was wiped out. Presumed dead, he went into hiding, living in a small underground shelter woven from bamboo and palm leaves. He caught fish and shrimp, made his own clothes from tree bark, and avoided contact with locals. In 1972, two fishermen stumbled upon him near a river. Believing they were under attack, Yokoi tried to defend himself, but the men subdued him, and, instead of harming him, brought him home and fed him. When he learned the war had been over for nearly 3 decades, Yokoi wept. Later, he returned to Japan, was officially demobilized, and even wrote a book about his years alone in the jungle. An even more famous case was Lieutenant Hiru Onoda, who commanded a small unit in the Philippines. Convinced the war continued, he led guerrilla raids against local authorities for nearly 30 years. It wasn't until 1974 that his former commanding officer, now long retired, personally traveled to the island to order him to stand down. Only then did Onoda surrender his sword. These isolated soldiers became legends, tragic symbols of devotion to a cause that no longer existed, but while a few men remained lost in the jungle, others faced judgment in the courts. Like Nazi Germany, the Empire of Japan had committed crimes that demanded justice. Across Asia, Allied powers set up trials for captured officers, soldiers, and officials accused of atrocities. Prisons were established in Hong Kong, Singapore, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies to hold those awaiting trial. But the process was complicated. The Japanese Prisoner of War Information Bureau, a body that should have helped gather evidence, instead interfered. Under orders from Japanese authorities, they withheld files from Allied prosecutors, releasing documents only when absolutely forced to. Language barriers made things worse. Few officials in the Japanese government spoke English well enough to communicate effectively with American and British investigators. Misunderstandings delayed proceedings for months. Eventually, the Allies made their intentions clear through the Potsdam Declaration, which set the terms of Japan's surrender. It called for the complete removal of those leaders who had deceived the nation and driven it toward war. To carry this out, the Allies established the Tokyo Trials, formerly known as the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. In 1946, 28 top leaders of the Japanese government and military, including former Prime Minister and Army General Hideki Tojo, were charged with war crimes. The list of accusations stretched from the invasion of China in the 1930s to the atrocities committed in Southeast Asia and the Pacific Islands. The trials lasted for more than 2 years. 2 of the accused died before judgment. 7, including Tojo, were sentenced to death. The rest received life imprisonment. Thousands of lower-ranking soldiers and officials were tried separately in local courts across Asia, where many were also executed or imprisoned. The Tokyo trials lasted nearly twice as long as the Nuremberg proceedings in Europe. Though often criticized for political bias and selective justice, they established crucial precedents in international law, including the legal concept of crimes against humanity. By the time the trials concluded in 1948, Japan was a broken nation. Once the heart of a vast empire, it was now a land in ruins, its economy shattered, its people exhausted, and its soldiers scattered, either dead, imprisoned, or living in shame. For years after, Japan existed under American control. It would not regain full sovereignty until 1952. During that period, the Japanese military was dissolved, and the country adopted a new constitution that forever banned offensive warfare. The aftermath of Japan's defeat was tragic. A long, painful reckoning with the consequences of aggression and pride. Millions of soldiers returned home to nothing. Others never came back at all. And for those captured by the Soviets or held in Allied camps, the memory of captivity would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The story of what happened to Axis soldiers after World War II, whether in Germany, Italy, or Japan, is one of suffering, survival, and moral complexity. It shows that even when the fighting ends, the wounds of war linger on, carried not just by nations, but by every man who once wore a uniform.